This is Criminal Interrupted. If you grew up before cell phones and neighbourhood watch apps, you know this feeling. The front door was a revolving one, the street was your playground, and the words, stranger danger, hadn't yet replaced, go outside and don't come back till the streetlights come on. We had a trust in our communities, an assurance that our neighbours weren't just people next door, they were part of our safety net. In 1998, in a suburban neighbourhood in Jacksonville, Florida, that trust was shattered forever. 8-year-old Maddie Clifton was just out for a few minutes to play baseball with her friend and neighbour, Josh Phillips. But when Maddie didn't return home, the entire community plunged into a frantic search, clinging to the hope that a carefree kid was simply just lost. What they didn't know was that the chilling answer wasn't across town or lost in the woods. It was hidden in the home right across the street, in the very bedroom of the boy who stood with the search parties. This is the story of how an age of innocence was violently interrupted by a moment of panic and murder, forcing an entire generation to rethink what it means to be safe at home. Madeline Ray Clifton was an 8-year-old girl, but if you look at how she was described, you get a full, vivid picture of the life that was taken. Maddie's family universally described her as being full of life, joy, and potential. She was a friendly girl with a freckle-dotted face and what her family called a Kool-Aid smile. Her older sister, Jessie, said Maddie had a heart for the underdog. She'd sometimes even root for the scary people or scary things in movies, because she didn't like the idea of anyone feeling isolated or lonely. Maddie was also a true tomboy. She loved playing the piano, but she was also just as passionate playing basketball or hitting golf balls around the neighbourhood. Crucially, the boy who lived across the street, Joshua Phillips, was not a stranger. He was a friend and a playmate of Maddie's. The boy at the centre of this tragedy was Joshua Phillips, born in Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1984. From a young age, Josh's home life was a source of crippling stress. His father, Steve Phillips, who was a drug addict and an alcoholic, was physically and emotionally abusive to both Josh and his mother, Melissa, who both lived in constant fear of him. Steve enforced strict, often irrational rules. He would get angry if Josh had friends over when he wasn't home, and he reportedly held a particular, unexplained dislike for young girls. This abusive environment was eventually compounded when Steve moved the family to Jacksonville, Florida, separating Josh from his half-brothers. Despite the turmoil at home, the 14-year-old Josh maintained a normal, friendly exterior. Neighbours and teachers constantly described him as quiet and friendly, popular, and without any prior history of violence or arrests. He seemed to fit right in, a fact supported by the Cliftons themselves. Maddie's mother, Sheila, confirmed the friendship between Maddie and Josh and said she never had any reason to fear him. Maddie's older sister, Jessie, who had even been filmed by Josh playing in his yard, described him as a pretty decent kid. Josh Phillips was, by all public accounts, just the normal, goofy teenager next door. No one could see the dangerous pressure cooker building beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary life. The timeline of November 3rd, 1998, began like any other school day. 8-year-old Maddie Clifton arrived home around 4:30 p.m., practiced her piano, and then went outside to play, just as we all did. She visited an older neighbour's yard before heading back to her own driveway. At that moment, a neighbour's grandmother saw Joshua Phillips creeping up on Maddie. She watched them for a few seconds but dismissed it, assuming they were just two kids playing a typical neighbourhood game. It was a moment that, tragically, passed without alarm. By 6:20 that evening, Maddie's mother called her children in for dinner. When Maddie didn't appear, Mrs. Clifton immediately panicked and called neighbours to help search. By 6:33 p.m, she called 911 to report her daughter missing. That same evening, a search was launched, and several neighbourhood children including Joshua Phillips himself, joined in. Witnesses later noted that Josh was acting normal, though he appeared as if he had just taken a shower. The very next day, a Jacksonville detective questioned Josh, who lied, claiming he had seen Maddie but hadn't played with her because of their age difference. Police searched the Phillips' yard and car but found nothing. A couple days later, a homicide detective even interviewed Josh in his own room, right where Maddie's body lay hidden. The truth would remain buried for about a week. On November 10th, 1998, Josh's mother, Melissa Phillips, was home and noticed a strong odour and liquid coming from under her son's waterbed. Upset and terrified by what she might find, she flagged down uniformed officers patrolling the street. When officers opened the bedroom door, the sickening truth was finally revealed. They saw 2 small feet in white socks sticking out from the wooden frame of the waterbed. The room, which contained air fresheners, rolls of tape, a hidden baseball bat, and a Leatherman knife, was immediately sealed as a crime scene. Josh was picked up at school and brought in for questioning, where there he confessed to the murder. According to Josh's confession, the violence began in his backyard. While playing baseball, he accidentally hit Maddie near the eye. She began to cry and scream, and Josh, terrified of the repercussions from his abusive father, dragged her into his bedroom. To silence her, he struck Maddie multiple times in the head with the baseball bat. He claimed that while dragging her, her clothing came off. When she continued to whimper and moan, he took his knife and he cut her throat. Josh then pried open the side of the waterbed frame and shoved her body inside. When his father came home shortly after, Josh realized that Maddie's labored breathing might be heard. In a chilling act of calculation, he confessed to pulling the child out and stabbing her in the lungs until she stopped breathing, then hiding her beneath the bed again. He insisted he did this all because he was afraid of getting in trouble. The evidence collected at the Phillips' house, however, paints a much darker picture than the accidental panic Josh described. Police found chilling proof of deception that cast doubt on the very beginning of his story. For instance, Josh claimed the murder began after he accidentally hit Maddie with a baseball in the backyard, yet investigators found no blood in the backyard or on the baseball itself. Furthermore, despite his claim that her clothes came off as he dragged her from outside, there was a noticeable absence of dirt or sand on Maddie's body. This strongly suggested the struggle and removal of clothing occurred entirely indoors. The crime scene in his room spoke volumes about the calculated efforts to hide the truth for 6 whole days. Beside the waterbed, police found not only the weapons, the baseball bat and the Leatherman knife, but also multiple types of air fresheners and rolls of tape, all pointing to a desperate, multi-day effort to conceal the horrific odour coming from beneath the mattress. And perhaps most chillingly, an investigator recalled seeing a missing person flyer of Maddie sitting right on Josh's desk, next to the very spot where she was hidden. The boy who was helping the search was, in reality, living in a fantasy of denial, sleeping feet from his victim. The state's medical expert also painted a picture of sustained brutality. They testified that Maddie suffered 3 separate attacks. She was struck 3 times in the head, injuries that would have been fatal on their own. Her throat was cut, which perforated her windpipe, and she died bleeding or drowning in her own blood. She was also stabbed 9 times in the chest and abdomen, though these wounds were inflicted post-mortem, which contradicted Josh's claims that he had killed her to end her suffering. And heartbreakingly, Maddie's hand was found clutching a bracket from the waterbed frame, confirming that she was still alive when Josh first shoved her underneath. The trial of Joshua Phillips was an international spectacle. Given the intense public scrutiny in Jacksonville, the trial was moved hundreds of miles away to Polk County, Florida. The central conflict of the case revolved entirely around the question we just posed. Was this a panic-driven mistake or a cold-blooded murder? Both the prosecution and the defense attempted to introduce evidence to support their respective narratives, though much of it was ruled inadmissible by the judge. The defense, for instance, fought to introduce scans from a neurologist showing Josh had bilateral lesions on his frontal lobe, a condition they argued could impair judgment and trigger the extreme panic that led to the murder. However, the prosecution, which sought to try Josh as an adult, was armed with its own theories. They wanted to present evidence that Josh had been viewing violent pornographic websites on his computer in the half hour immediately preceding the murder, suggesting the killing may have been sexually motivated, or at least complicated by factors beyond mere panic. The judge in the end ruled both the brain scans and the pornographic evidence could not be presented to the jury. With key evidence barred, the defense, led by attorney Richard Nichols, adopted a highly unusual and risky strategy. They called not a single witness. The defense chose to rest their case entirely on the closing argument, painting Maddie's death as, quote, an act that began as an accident and deteriorated through panic that bordered on madness. But the prosecution countered with the brutal facts of the 6-day cover-up. They argued the murder was, quote, diabolical, devious, and sophisticated, pointing out that Josh ate dinner with his family and sat with detectives, all while Maddie's body was a few feet away. They highlighted the numerous stab wounds inflicted after the initial beating, asserting this was a deliberate choice, not an accident. In the end, the jury needed only 2 hours to deliberate. On July 15, 1999, Joshua Phillips, at the age of 15, was convicted of first-degree murder. The conviction carried an automatic sentence under Florida law at the time, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Justice had been served for Maddie Clifton, but for Joshua Phillips, the debate over whether a child could be sentenced to die in prison was just the beginning. Joshua Phillips's life sentence began immediately. And while Maddie Clifton was denied the rest of her existence, her killer began his own decades-long journey of self-improvement. It is a grim reality of the justice system that while Maddie's development was brutally halted at age 8, Phillips was granted the time and resources to mature. Throughout his appeals, even the prosecution felt obligated to acknowledge that Phillips had been a model prisoner. Behind bars, Phillips has built a new life. He completed his GED, took college classes, and now occupies his time assisting other inmates as a paralegal, which to me is a disturbing fact after taking into account his crime. He tutors, he plays guitar in a prison band, and dedicates himself to personal growth through Christian services, Zen meditation, and yoga. As of 2008, Phillips declined to write a formal apology to the Cliftons. His reasoning? He claimed they deserved to hear his sincerity in person, because a letter wouldn't convey his true feelings. This was a request Maddie's mother promptly and firmly rejected. The idea that the person who stole her daughter's future should demand a face-to-face meeting to prove his own emotional progress is laughable, in my own opinion. And on June 27, 2000, Josh's abusive father, the very man whose fear he claimed drove the murder, was killed in a car accident. 4 years, the life sentence was upheld, including a ruling by the Florida 2nd District Court of Appeal in 2002. Yet, the tide of opinion slowly began to shift. In a remarkable turn, by 2008, 2 of the officials most responsible for securing the life sentence, State Attorney Harry Shorstein and Sheriff Nat Glover, admitted they were having second thoughts about giving a life sentence without parole to a 14-year-old. Shorstein even voiced support for eventual clemency, regretting that he hadn't offered Phillips a second-degree murder plea, which would have given the judge more sentencing discretion. The legal fight intensified following a landmark decision. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court case of Miller v. Alabama ruled that sentencing juveniles to mandatory life in prison without parole is unconstitutional. This decision acknowledged that a child's brain is fundamentally different from an adult's. This landmark ruling gave Phillips's attorneys the basis for an appeal, and in September 2016, Phillips was granted a new sentencing hearing. That hearing was held in June 2017, where Maddie's mother tragically requested that his original sentence be upheld. The result, in November 2017, was a resentencing to life in prison, which, under the new laws, made him eligible for review and possible modification in 2023, based on demonstrated maturity and rehabilitation. This sentence was upheld by the appeals court in 2019, and though the Florida Supreme Court refused to hear his final appeal in 2020, Phillips's case now rests on that 2023 review. The process involves his legal team formally petitioning the court and presenting evidence of his rehabilitation, his maturity, and his behaviour as a model inmate over the last 2 decades. Phillips and his legal team have been preparing for the review since becoming eligible in 2023. Reports indicate that he has been moved back to the Duval County Area Jail to be closer to the courts as he awaits and prepares for the actual hearing. The case remains active and is proceeding towards a formal judicial review where his life sentence will once again be scrutinised. The legal system may endlessly debate culpability, brain development, and sentencing guidelines, but the true, profound weight of this case lies with the family of Madeline Ray Clifton. Maddie was 8 years old, a sweet girl with a Kool-Aid smile and a zest for life that was brutally extinguished by the very neighbour she trusted. Her murder was more than a single crime. For the people of Jacksonville, and for parents everywhere, the idea that a child could simply go outside to play and never come back, hidden right across the street in a neighbour's room, shattered the foundational belief that childhood and home were sanctuaries. Maddie never got to complete her 4th grade year, never got to truly explore her love for basketball and piano, and never got to experience the future that was so cruelly stolen from her. Her short life became a devastating symbol of lost innocence, a reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers are hidden in plain sight, just beyond the welcome mat. Maddie Clifton's memory is carried forward by a family whose hearts were eternally broken, and while the killer remains behind bars, the only sentence that truly mattered, the life sentence of grief for the Cliftons, and the final, brutal sentence for Maddie, is the one that can never be appealed. Thank you for listening.